Hello again. This is Jessum Guy, and this is Jessum Guy's podcast, and this is episode 4. Please remember, the key of my idea discussed with you is a society, copied from the Jesuits as to organization. I believe until the world comes to its senses, you should declare war. I mean a commercial war, with those who are trying to boycott your manufacturers. That is my program. You might finish the war by union with America and a universal peace. I mean after 100 years, in a secret society organized like Loyola's, supported by the accumulated wealth of those whose aspiration is a desire to do something, and a hideous annoyance created by the difficult question daily placed before their minds as to which of their incompetent relations they should leave their wealth to. What an awful thought that it is that if we had not lost America, or if even now we could arrange with present members of the United States Assembly and our House of Commons, the peace of the world is secured for all eternity. We could hold your federal parliament 5 years at Washington and 5 in London. The only thing feasible to carry this idea out is a secret one, a society gradually absorbing the wealth of the world to be devoted to such an object. Fancy the charm to young America, just coming out on dissatisfied, for they have filled up their own country and do not know what to tackle next, to share in a scheme to take the government of the world. From The Last Will and Testament of Cecil John Rhodes, 1902. Alright, welcome to episode number 4. We are going to jump right into chapter 4, the buffer fringe of Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. We're going to skip over chapter 3, mainly because it deals with Russia, and Quigley, essentially, this is mainly a bunch of propaganda against Russia. He's going to talk about its economy. He's going to talk about how backwards they were. He's going to talk about, he's going to try to talk about philosophy and Orthodox Christianity and their outlook, but he's really bad at that, and it's not, in my opinion, even worth discussion. If you want to read it, go right on ahead. The only thing really of note is on page 89 that there was an educated class of reformers, what he calls westernizers, that they called themselves the intelligentsia. And he says in general they argued that Russia was merely a backward and barbaric fringe of Western civilization, and that it must pass through the same economic, political, and social developments as the West. And the Westernizers wish to speed up these developments. And these intelligentsia became disillusioned with the West and the church, and of course the government, and they tried to recruit the peasants for reformation, and they were rejected by them. And because they could find no social group on which to base a reform program, they basically turned into nihilists and anarchists. And it's interesting to note that the same way that liberalism was the means by which to bring about change in society, nihilism was also a rejection of all conventions in the name of individualism. So we see multiple ideologies have what seems to be unique and distinct, have the same end goals. And on page 91, he says this fantastic philosophy is of great significance because it prepared the ground for Bolshevism. Out of the same spiritual sickness which produced nihilism emerged anarchism. To the anarchist, the chief of all enslaving and needless conventionalities was the state. This is the same thing we sort of covered on page 24 with the liberal enlightenment movements. Pretty much said the same thing. So they attempted to westernize Russia, didn't work the same way, so they hit it from another angle with nihilism and anarchism. Both resulted in the same thing. They are all revolutionary movements. And he continues at the bottom of page 91. He says, just about 1890, Western industrialism began to grow under governmental and foreign auspices. Then an urban proletariat began to appear. And then the Marxist social theory, which was imported from Germany, and the growth of a proletariat gave these revolutionaries, once again, a social group on which to build. Marxist theory gave the intelligentsia an ideology in which they can fanatically embrace. Now, Quigley himself doesn't flesh this completely out in this chapter. You could read Anthony Sutton's book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, about the money power that was also behind the Russian Revolution and importing Bolshevism. And again, for the same purpose as the liberal movements did in Western Europe, same thing happened in Russia. Just it needed communism to do those things. So these two ideologies, liberalism, communism, birth from the same revolutionary tree. And with that, we are going to jump into chapter 4, starting on page 130. Until 1870, there was no professorship of fine arts at Oxford, but in that year, thanks to the Slade bequest, John Ruskin was named such a chair. Ruskin spoke to the Oxford undergraduates as members of the privileged ruling class. He told them that they were the possessors of a magnificent tradition of education, beauty, rule of law, freedom, decency, and self-discipline, but that this tradition could not be saved. It did not deserve to be saved unless it could be extended to the lower classes in England itself and to the non-English speaking masses throughout the world. If this precious tradition were not extended to those two great majorities, the minority of upper-class Englishmen would ultimately be submerged by these majorities and the tradition lost. To prevent this, the tradition must be extended to the masses and to the empire. Ruskin's message had a sensational impact. His inaugural lecture was copied out in longhand by one undergraduate, Cecil Rhodes, who kept it with him for 40 years. Rhodes feverishly exploited the diamond and gold fields of South Africa, rose to be Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, contributed money to political parties, controlled parliamentary seats both in England and in South Africa, and sought to win a strip of British territory across Africa, from the Cape of Good Hope to Egypt, and to join these two extremes together with a telegraph line and ultimately with a Cape to Cairo railway. With financial support from Lord Rothschild and Alfred Bate, he was able to monopolize the diamond mines of South Africa as De Beers Consolidated Mines, and to build up a great gold mining enterprise as Consolidated Goldfields. In the middle of the 1890s, Rhodes had a personal income of at least £1 million sterling a year, which was then about $5 million, which was spent so freely for his mysterious purposes that he was usually overdrawn on his account. These purposes centered on his desire to federate the English-speaking peoples and to bring all the habitable portions of the world under their control. For this purpose, Rhodes left part of his great fortune to found the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, in order to spread the English ruling class tradition throughout the English-speaking world as Ruskin had wanted. Among Ruskin's most devoted disciples at Oxford were a group of intimate friends, including Arnold Toynbee, Alfred Lord Milner, Arthur Glazebrook, George Parkin, Philip Littleton Gell, and Henry Birchenough. These were so moved by Ruskin that they devoted the rest of their lives to carrying out his ideas. A similar group of Cambridge men, including Reginald Balliol Brett, or Lord Esher, Sir John B. Seeley, Albert Lord Grey, and Edmund Garrett, were also aroused by Ruskin's message and devoted their lives to the extension of the British Empire. They were remarkably successful in these aims because England's most sensational journalist, William T. Stead, an ardent social reformer and imperialist, brought them in association with Cecil Rhodes. This association was formally established on February 5, 1891, when Rhodes and Stead organized a secret society of which Rhodes had been dreaming for 16 years. In this secret society, Rhodes was to be leader, Stead, Brett, and Milner were to form an executive committee. Arthur Balfour, Harry Johnston, Lord Rothschild, Albert Grey, and others were listed as potential members of circles of initiates, while there was to be an outer circle known as the Association of Helpers, later organized by Milner as the Round Table Organization. This group was able to get access to Rhodes' money after his death in 1902, and also to the funds of loyal Rhodes supporters like Alfred Bate and Sir Abe Bailey. With this backing, they sought to extend and execute the ideals that Rhodes had obtained from Ruskin and Stead. They were joined in their efforts by other Ruskinite friends of Stead's like Lord Grey, Lord Esher, and Flora Shaw, later Lady Lugard. In 1890, by a stratagem too elaborate to describe here, Miss Shaw became head of the colonial department of The Times, while still remaining on the payroll of Stead's Pall Mall Gazette. In this post, she played a major role in the next 10 years in carrying into execution the imperial schemes of Cecil Rhodes, to whom Stead had introduced her in 1889. In the meantime, in 1884, acting under Ruskin's inspiration, a group which included Arnold Toynbee, Milner, Gell, Grey, Seeley, and Michael Glazebrook, founded the first settlement house, an organization by which educated upper-class people could live in the slums in order to assist, instruct, and guide the poor, with particular emphasis on social welfare and adult education. The new enterprise, set up in East London with P.L. Gell as chairman, was named Toynbee Hall after Arnold Toynbee, who died at age 31 in 1883. This was the original model for the thousands of settlement houses, such as Hull House in Chicago, now found throughout the world, and was one of the seeds from which the modern movement for adult education and university extension grew. As Governor-General and High Commissioner of South Africa in the period of 1887 to 1905, Milner recruited a group of young men, chiefly from Oxford and Toynbee Hall, to assist him in organizing his administration. Through his influence, these men were able to win influential posts in government and international finance and become the dominant influence in British imperial and foreign affairs up to 1939. Under Milner in South Africa, they were known as Milner's Kindergarten until 1910. In 1909 to 1913, they organized semi-secret groups known as Round Table groups in the chief British dependencies and the United States. These still function in 8 countries. They kept in touch with each other by personal correspondence and frequent visits, and through an influential quarterly magazine, The Round Table, founded in 1910 and largely supported by Sir A. Bailey's money. In 1919, they founded the Royal Institute of International Affairs, or Chatham House, for which the chief financial supporters were Sir A. Bailey and the Astor family, which were the owners of the Times. Similar institutes of international affairs were established in the chief dominions and in the United States, where it is known as the Council on Foreign Relations, in the period of 1919 to 1927. After 1925, a somewhat similar structure of organizations known as the Institute of Pacific Relations was set up in 12 countries holding territory in the Pacific area. The units of each British Dominion existing on interlocking basis with the Round Table Group and the Royal Institute of International Affairs in the same country. The power and influence of this Rhodes-Milner Group in British imperial affairs and in foreign policy since 1889, although not widely recognized, can hardly be exaggerated. We might mention as an example that this group dominated the Times from 1890 to 1912 and has controlled it completely since 1912. Because the Times has been owned by the Astor family since 1922, this Rhodes-Milner Group was sometimes spoken of as the Cliveden set, named after the Astor country house where they sometimes assembled. Numerous other papers and journals have been under the control or influence of this group since 1889. They have also established and influenced numerous university and other chairs of imperial affairs and international relations. Some of these are the Bate chairs at Oxford, the Montague Burton chair at Oxford, the Rhodes chair at London, the Stevenson chair at Chatham House, the Williamson chair at Aberystwyth, and others, as well as such important sources as of influence as Rhodes House at Oxford. From 1884 to about 1915, the members of this group worked valiantly to extend the British Empire and to organize it in a federal system. They were constantly harping on the lessons to be learned from the failure of the American Revolution and the success of the Canadian Federation of 1867, and hoped to federate the various parts of the empire as seemed feasible, then confederate the whole of it with the United Kingdom into a single organization. They also hoped to bring the United States into this organization to whatever degree was possible. Okay, so I'm sorry if that was a lot of just reading. That was from pages 130 to 133, but that was just a lot of dense information that probably would have been too jaggedy and just not good if I would have just tried to pick a little here and a little there. It's better to just hear it directly from the horse's mouth, how this thing was set up and how this thing was organized. This is more fleshed out in Quigley's other book, The Anglo-American Establishment. Much smaller book, but it's a lot more condensed version of this whole story and of all these people and their aims and their goals. So I decided to jump right into the meat of the matter, and I skipped over some of the things earlier in the chapter that I would like to go back and kind of briefly cover. Page 115, towards the beginning of the chapter, it talks about Balkan nationalism and how nationalism, again, was an early liberal movement, was a very potent factor in the disruption of the Ottoman Empire. He says only after 1878. And after getting to a lot of the intrigues in the Balkans with, Turkey, Germany, some of the other great powers, and their intrigues and trying to break up the Ottoman Empire, he does on page 120 talk about what he says the most important and perhaps was the projected Berlin to Baghdad Railway, which was completed its main trunk line from the Austro-Hungarian border to Nusaybin and northern Mesopotamia by September of 1918. He says this Berlin to Baghdad Railway would have solved crucial problems. It put the German metallurgical industry in touch with the great metal resources of Anatolia, put Germany textile industry in touch with the supplies of wool, cotton and hemp of the Balkans, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. In fact, it brought to almost every branch of German industry the possibility of finding its solution for its critical market and raw material problems. Best of all, these connections being almost entirely overland would be within reach of the German army and beyond the reach of the British Navy. And thinking back to before when he talks about Britain's policy of consistently assisting the second strongest continental power against the strongest, they were always intriguing against the uprising of a competition, which at this point in time, prior to World War I, was going to be Germany, of course. And he says on the bottom of page 121, for more than 10 years, Russia, Britain, and France showed violent disapproval, and they did all they could to obstruct this project. And during the period of disapproval, the great powers concerned issued such a barrage of propaganda against the plan that it is necessary even today to warn against its influence. And they were trying to propagandize German imperialism, that they were the aggressors seeking to weaken and destroy the Ottoman Empire. And he says that the evidence showed quite the contrary. Germany was the only great power which wanted the Ottoman Empire to be strong and intact. He says that Britain wanted it to be weak and intact. France generally shared the British point of view, although the French, with a $500 million investment in the area, wanted Turkey to be prosperous as well. Russia wanted it to be weak and partitioned, a view which was shared by the Italians and to some extent by the Austrians. So, again, the propaganda that Germany was seeking imperialism and was the aggressor was false. Britain generally led the charge in disrupting it and the propaganda against it. But essentially, he says on page 123 that eventually all of the great powers relented and sort of leveraged support to gain from this. And one of the more important things he points out was that Britain would have exclusive control over the commercial activities of Kuwait, the only good port on the upper Persian Gulf, and that a monopoly over the oil reserves from the area from Mosul to Baghdad would be given to a new corporation in which British finances would have half interest, Royal Dutch Shell Company a quarter interest, and the Germans a quarter interest. So we see the early indications that Britain was very well aware of the importance of energy and the importance of oil this early on. And another things was these agreements. They divided up Turkey into what they call spheres of influence. And the struggles of the great powers for profit and influence and the wreckage of this Ottoman Empire said had profound effects on Turkish domestic affairs, and this ended up leading to the Young Turks, which is something he's going to talk about a little bit later, but doesn't really dig into there. Now, on page 125, he starts talking about the British imperial crisis. He's going to talk about Britain's role in Africa, Ireland, India, and all of their colonial dependencies. So these next few pages talks about how the statement that England acquired its empire in a fit of absent-mindedness. He says much of the empire was acquired by private individuals and commercial firms and was taken over by the British government much later. So you had sort of an early public-private partnership between big money industrialists and the government of Britain at the time. Page 126, he talks about England's balance of power. Again, we talked how they would constantly help the second strongest against the strongest to prevent any direct competition from the continent. He later talks about the rivalry between the monarch and the aristocracy in England and the landed gentry, how the control of the courts and the parliament. It made it possible for this ruling group in England to override the rights of the peasants in the land and to eject them from the land, to enclose the open fields of the medieval system, to deprive the cultivators of their manorial rights, and thus reduce them to the condition of landless rural laborers or of tenants. I believe this is something that reading on Power by De Joval, I think I pronounced that wrong, sort of talks about the high versus low, or high and low versus middle power. I believe he talks about that. It's a good breakdown of how that works. And he says, after 1870, it became increasingly evident that however expensive colonies might be to a government, they could be fantastically profitable to individuals and companies supported by such governments. Moreover, with the spread of democracy and the growing influence of the press and the expanding need for campaign contributions, individuals who made fantastic profits in overseas adventures could obtain favorable support from their governments by contributing some part of their profits to politicians' expenses. So again, using the government to protect overseas finances and investments, something that we see happening today, and it's almost obvious. Just can't even hide it really anymore. The next few sections in the British Imperial Crisis section is going to talk about their role in Egypt and the Sudan, East Central Africa, South Africa, the making of the Commonwealth, East Africa, India, and Ireland. Few minor things, I guess, to talk about that's sort of important to make note of. At the bottom of page 133, he talks about Benjamin Disraeli's purchase of the Suez Canal using Rothschild money. Page 136 and 137, he has a little propaganda against the Boers of South Africa. He talks about the Transvaal president, Paul Kruger, who was negotiating with Germans at the time for protection. So again, we sort of have this issue between Germany and Britain. This obviously pissed off Rhodes, and he organized the Jameson raids, which was a huge failure. But these a couple pages are pretty significant to read because it shows how sort of early versions of color revolutions are concocted with a combination of high finance, the government, and of course the media for the propaganda cover. Page 138, again, more reasons for the British to instigate versus Germany. Leading up into World War I, the Germans were sympathetic to the Boers, and the Germans started a naval program in 1900. So these few pages are good for overall context, give an idea of the geopolitical situation that was going to lead up to World War I, and lets you understand a little bit of some of the propaganda that was being played out in the background. Page 144 starts the section of making the Commonwealth. As soon as South Africa was united in 1910, Milner's kindergarten returned to London to try to federate the whole empire by the same methods. They were in a hurry to achieve this before the war with Germany, which they believed to be approaching. So again, it kind of leads on, they sort of knew that the war was imminent. Granted, could have been obvious, but as we will see, there's a reason they knew it was imminent. With Abe Bailey money, they founded the Round Table under Kerr's editorship, met in formal conclaves presided over by Milner to decide the fate of the empire, and recruited new members to their group, chiefly from New College, of which Milner was a fellow. The new recruits included historians F.S. Oliver, Alfred Zimmern, Sir Reginald Copeland, Lord Lovat, and Waldorf, Lord Astor. Lionel Curtis and others were sent around the world to organize roundtable groups in the chief British dependencies. For several years, the roundtable groups worked desperately trying to find an acceptable formula for federating the empire. 3 books and many articles emerged from these discussions, but gradually it became clear that federation was not acceptable to the English-speaking dependencies. Gradually it was decided to dissolve all formal bonds between these dependencies, except perhaps allegiance to the crown, and depend on the common outlook of Englishmen to keep the empire together. This involved changing the name British Empire to Commonwealth of Nations, as in the title of Lionel Curtis's book of 1916, giving the chief dependencies, including India and Ireland, their complete independence, working to bring the United States more closely into the same orientation, and seeking to solidify the intangible links of sentiment by propaganda among financial, educational, and political leaders in each country. So this entire section is about their aims to federate all of these British colonies that they built up and how badly it failed. During the decade of 1919 to 1929, the Rhodes-Milner Group gave the chief impetus towards transforming the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations and launching India on the road to responsible self-government. The creation of the roundtable groups by Milner's kindergarten in 1909 to 1913 opened a new day in both of these fields, although the whole group was so secretive that even today many close students of the subject are not aware of its significance. These men had formed their intellectual growth at Oxford on Pericles' funeral orientation, as described in a book by a member of the group, Sir Alfred Zimmern's The Greek Commonwealth, on Edmund Burke's On Conciliation with America, on Sir J.B. Seeley's Growth of British Policy, and on A.V. Dicey's The Law and Custom of the Constitution, and on the New Testament's Sermon on the Mount. Lionel Curtis wrote in The Problem of a Commonwealth in 1916, quote, "If political power is granted to groups before they are fit, they will tend to rise to the need. This was the spirit which Milner's group tried to use towards the Boers in 1902, towards India in 1910, and unfortunately toward Hitler in 1933. This is our first admission of their role in Hitler's Germany. Moving along, starting on page 176, he talks about the Far East leading up to World War I and starts off with the collapse of China. Page 180, he describes the Opium Wars, using armed force to import drugs into China. So these people have been drug runners from the beginning, even up to today's alphabet agencies. Probably shouldn't say the real world word because of algorithms. On page 85, he gives a good example of cheap imports from another country, how it destroys local markets and its people. And this is, of course, how Britain forced the open door free trade policy on China, which really wrecked their markets at the time. They imposed treaties to prevent duties on more than maybe 5 to 8%. And these, it says basically Europeans controlled the Asian markets in these days. On page 190, he describes how Chinese students were studying abroad and they had acquired Western ideas which were completely incompatible with the older Chinese system. In general, such Western ideas were not traditionalist or authoritarian and were thus destructive to Chinese patriarchal family, to ancestor worship, or to the imperial autocracy. These students brought back from abroad Western ideas of science, of democracy, of parliamentarianism, of empiricism, self-reliance, liberalism, individualism, and pragmatism. Their possession of such ideas made them impossible for them to fit into their own country, and as a result, they attempted to change it, develop a revolutionary fervor which merged with the anti-dynastic secret societies which had existed in China since Mencius took over the country in 1644. So he does briefly discuss secret societies in other countries, also seeking to overthrow the existing power structures of their days. Page 192 starts talking about Japan, and on page 194 talks about the black ships of Matthew Perry that sailed into Japan to force open their markets. Now see, back in their day, they had no issue with using brute force to pry open markets in foreign lands. Today, they need to be a little bit more, sophisticated with propaganda and such. And now, forcing open markets in other countries is under the guise of freeing oppressed peoples and spreading democracy and overthrowing dictators and all the like. That's what's necessary today. They can't just roll up with ships and start blowing people up anymore. On page 195, he talks about a shadowy group known as the Meiji oligarchy that controlled Japan by 1889. This little story is another example of power hiding behind an emperor and a constitution. On page 200, he talks about the Genro, or the Council of Elder Statesmen. And so here Quigley tells us again of another secret society that helped rule Japan. On page 201, he talks about the Meiji Restoration of 1868. And again, industrialists, mainly Mitsubishi and Mitsui, financing Japan's revolution. In 2002, on page 202, it's kind of funny. He talks about they built up an opposition to the government, organizing the first real political parties, the Liberal Party and the Progressive Party. And he says that these parties adopted liberal and popular ideologies from bourgeois Europe, but generally these were not sincerely held or clearly understood. The real aim of these two groups was to make themselves so much of a nuisance to the prevailing oligarchy that they could obtain, as a price for relaxing their attacks, a share of patronage of public office and of government contracts. So we had grifters in the 1800s using SJW shit to try to gain power. It's pretty funny. On page 203, he talks about the Zaibatsu, which was industrial monopolist and the public-private partnership with the governments and the oligarchy. There was fake competition. But of course, they were coordinated together and they played by the rules of the system of which they all accepted. So again, this is something that we see here in America as well. But I highlight kind of all these little tiny spots to kind of show that, yes, even in China, they had their own secret societies. Japan had their own secret societies, their own oligarchs. And this isn't just some conspiracy of the Brits, just some conspiracy of the Jews. It kind of involves a little bit of everybody. Of course, this book mainly deals with the Anglo-American establishment, with Quigley being an Anglophile, but you get the gist that there was sort of a worldwide revolution going on through all societies starting roughly in the 1800s. And that basically wraps up chapter 3 and chapter 4. The next chapter, chapter 5, he's going to start the First World War in the years 1914 to 1918.